The 8th generation 911 is also the most technologically advanced, and the 4S as we got here is the result. Think 450 horsepower, twin turbocharged, dynamic all-wheel drive, PASM, PTM. It's dripping in tech, isn't it? But for all the tech on this young whippersnapper, it kind of reminds you of something else. Separated by some 35 years of Porsche production, the hallowed 959 and current 992 generation Carrera 4S may look completely different, but under the surface these two have far more in common than you may realise. Both have twin turbocharged flat 6 engines of around 3 litre capacity, putting out 450 horsepower. Both are all-wheel drive, and much of the tech behind those weird Porsche acronyms I mentioned, such as PTM and PASM, started life on the 959. In today's in-depth test, we're going to explore the similarities and differences between these two distant Porsche relatives. But first, let's chat to the 959's owner, Paul, to set the scene for its significance and ability. Paul, it's a nice day for a 959 drive, isn't it?
Oh, every day's a good day for a 959 drive, but yes, particularly today.
What was it like in the 80s when the 959 came out then? You know, what were your feelings there? And also, what's it like now to actually own the car?
In the 80s, and I think I've described it to you before, it was like a spaceship. It was just light years ahead of anything at the time. You take a 3.2 Carrera and then suddenly you produce this car with 4-wheel drive, ABS brakes, tyre pressure monitoring system, self-leveling suspension. I mean, you go on and on and on. And it just incredible, absolutely incredible. And to drive it now, it still feels, and I think one of our friends said, it feels like the future now, and it still feels like a modern day car. There's just the docility of it when you want it to be docile, and then savage when you want it to be. The performance is there, but it's not a rough performance. It's a smooth, almost turbine-like.
For all the technology on the car and the power, it's double the 3.2 Carrera's power near enough of the time. But it's actually really nice to drive, even around town.
No, the hardest thing about driving around town is how nervous you are in this car. And that suddenly the Honda Jazz appears from nowhere. No, it is. It's relaxed. You can be at 70 miles an hour. I've got the modern PCM in the car. You can have a conversation. And but actually for me, it's the quality of the build is incredible. Everything you touch is just feels solid and honed, and much more so than perhaps another car of the era. Perhaps that reflects the hand-built nature of it, and the materials used. Yes, it's a similar layout and everything, but actually it just feels that cut above.
What do you know about the history of this particular car?
Well, this was one of the 8 or so that was produced in 1992 to a phase 2. It's been back to Porsche Germany, to the classic department, had an awful lot of money spent prior to my ownership, and I think that's reflected certainly in the condition and the usability of the car. And I took the decision to take it back to Porsche Classic for the service, partly because of the journey and the trip, but also for the history of the car and just having that confidence. It's been used, it's done 59,000 kilometres, but just very up together.
I hope the audience are just as grateful as I am in terms of how much you like to drive the cars and certainly have them documented and allow others to see them and experience them. I think that's like super important.
I get the pleasure of driving it, and other people I enjoy the fact that people are interested in the car, they want to know about it, and we've discussed in the past that child or teenager or somebody who gets inspired by it is your collector of the future, and I think as cars get more and more sanitised, we are going to be driving electrics. The older ones, and particularly the iconic ones, are going to become much more important to give people the history of where the cars came from, and I think that's really important.
So, back at the scene of the crime. Don't think that door's quite closed. There we go, the proper Porsche clink. So yes, back at the scene of the crime. You may remember my video driving this thing on the Autobahn 1 whole year ago now. Had a little bit of a cry in the car, didn't I? I hope I won't be doing that today, but the significance of sitting at the wheel of the GOAT one more time is not lost on me, that's for sure. So we're not looking at outright speed on the 959 today. As we know, we're just looking at its significance as a technical and engineering masterpiece and its legacy and impact it's had on Porsche as a company in the 35 years since. First impressions from sitting in this car, as you can imagine, well, it really does feel like a G-Series car of the time, mixed in with a little bit of 964 with this kind of centre console here and where the shifter is mounted as well. There are a few differences, of course. You've got the Bilstein active damping dials ahead, as well as the ride height, and a digital clock as well. Now that is quite significant in itself. Not for the fact that there's a digital clock in a 1980s car, but the fact that it's down here by the transmission tunnel. Of course, connoisseurs will know that on the air-cooled cars, the famous 5-dial instrument cluster ahead of the driver, the clock is usually reserved for the far right dial. Now, the reason the clock has been moved down there is because in front of me, I am blessed with an absolute wealth of information that really is the main giveaway in regards to this being technological tour de force. I'll talk you through it. So on the far left dial, all of them are VDO still, by the way, in keeping with period dials of the time in Porsche 911s. But the far left dial has a fuel gauge and a temperature gauge for water. Don't forget the 959 is air and water cooled. So that gives me a reading of the water temperature from the water cooled heads. Dial 2 has oil temperature and oil pressure and an illumination for the hydraulic ride height adjuster. Centre dial is, of course, engine speed. It's always in the centre of any Porsche because it's not how fast you go, it's how you get there. Not necessarily with this thing, mind. Beneath engine speed, you've got a boost pressure gauge that goes up to 2.5 bar. Above the tacho, you've got two lights. One is what we now know in modern times to be a PASM light, which just basically tells you if the 959 suspension is stiffened or not. To the right of the tacho, you've got the speedo with, of course, the odometer and the trip computer. And then to the right of that, where the clock used to be, you basically have information regarding the diffs and the torque split. Built within that gauge, you have four lights that basically you can toggle between to trigger different traction setups according to the weather. So you've got sunny, rain and snow highlighted by their buttons, and you can toggle between those thanks to this little lever hanging off the steering wheel column. This same tech, including active PSK, now PTM, plus tyre pressure monitoring and wet mode, at least in concept, can all be found on the 992, displayed not via VDO gauges, but digitally on screens. That's in front of me. The steering wheel itself, I mean, it's G-Series to all intents and purposes, apart from the fact it says 959 below the Porsche lettering. There's no rake adjustment to it. It is fixed. It's a little bit awkward. It's quite near the dash and not far from my knees. It's kind of the big thing that I would say from a driver's point of view lets the 959 down. Anyway, transmission tunnel, as I say, we saw that kind of come into its own for the 964. I mentioned the two switches we've got ahead of the shifter. Again, one to tweak the suspension stiffness and then also to adjust the ride height. The shifter itself reverses out and left just like the later 3.2 Carreras. However, they are 5-speed. This is 5-speed plus 1. Now what I mean by that is, and if you take a look atop the shifter, it's dogleg down to first. Where first is, there's actually G. Now G stands for Galanda, which is terrain. Officially speaking, the 959 does have a terrain gear. It essentially has a lower ratio than first. Now, driving around in that today, I'm not so sure about that. To me, it just feels like an ordinary first. There is a school of thought that Porsche used G instead of 1 back in the 80s to pass emissions tests because the test was done in first gear. Now, with first essentially being second, allegedly there was a bit of a workaround. I'm not so sure, but Porsche officially says that that G stands for terrain. But again, I use that to move off from a standstill, even on tarmac or concrete like I am today. Let's fire the goat up, take it out for a drive, and have a look at how this car influenced Porsche sports cars in the 35 years since. Now, in the pub chat topic of greatest Porsche of all time, from what I've found, the most common answer seems to be the Carrera GT. People just revert to that naturally aspirated V10 engine and the glorious sound that it represents. Now, for me, I'm firmly in the 959 camp because while the Carrera GT is an absolutely phenomenal car, the Carrera GT hasn't overly influenced the company since in terms of how it thinks and how it produces its cars. The 959 nearly broke Porsche as a company in the 1980s, but without a doubt it has gone on to define it since, again with reference to the sports cars that it's made. I mean, this car's legacy and DNA permeates right the way through the 911 lineup, right the way to today, 35 years after these cars were first created. I mean, that is absolutely mind-boggling. can you think of a car today that is likely to have the same impact on the automotive market in 35 years' time? Let's go through the 911 generation by generation and assess the impact and influence this car had on them. 964, of course, the advent of all-wheel drive, debuting on the 964 Carrera 4 of 1988. The 993 introduced twin turbocharging, although the setup was different. The 996, of course, introduced water cooling to the 911 and PSM, of course. The 959's heads are water cooled, so again, this is technology that Porsche was looking at a decade before series production of the 996. The 997, of course, saw the introduction of active suspension management and, latterly, tyre pressure monitoring. The 991 introduced, among other things, niceties such as front axle lift, and the 992 gave us wet mode. Again, all technology that started right here on the GOAT back in 1986. And for me, that is why the 959 is, behind the 911 itself, quite simply the greatest sports car Porsche has ever produced. It is simply crazy, therefore, that this car was very nearly not made. Originally conceived with Group B rallying in mind, but it was the road car really that was most impressive because it gave all of this technology in a car that, to be honest with you, is so easy to drive. The car is so well planted on the road, and again, for some context, 450 horsepower, same as the 992, doesn't seem like a lot today. Back in 1986, the 911 had exactly half of that. As I mentioned on the Autobahn video last year, this car nearly took Porsche down, and there's real strong arguments that it cost Helmut Bott and then CEO Peter Schutz their jobs, where the project ran considerably over time and considerably over budget. But Porsche was persistent in its investment in technology. It was technology that was, without a doubt, completely pioneering at the time, and again has kind of been paid back in kind because it's still relevant today. The costs and delays came down to the fact that Porsche had to rely on a lot of third-party companies to develop the technology that would go on this car. For example, Porsche had to rely on Dunlop to create tyres specifically designed to accommodate speeds in excess of 200 miles an hour for long periods of time, and which could run flat for up to 50 miles. Bilstein as well had to develop the active damper technology. Webco had to develop Kevlar panels that had unique curves in them. Bosch had to substantially upgrade its Motronic system to monitor acceleration, braking, traction, engine speed, all of these new parameters up to 200 times a second. And that again all helped the technology on this car work, with particular reference to the PSK active all-wheel drive system on this car. Now again, a rendition of the PSK system is to all intents and purposes still used today. There's no centre diff, it's a multi-plate clutch, albeit on the 992 it's lighter, substantially lighter, and water-cooled as well. But the PSK system was clever because torque was constantly monitored and distributed between the front and rear axle, not just during tyre slip, but again just to suit driving conditions as well as driver style. In normal conditions such as now, the torque was split 40% to the front, 60% to the back. That mirrors the weight distribution on the 959. Under hard acceleration, up to 80% of torque goes to the back of the car, and in wet conditions the torque is split evenly, 50-50. Incredibly clever technology. The four-wheel drive PSK system on here really is the jewel in the crown of the 959, and again, it works, and it works splendidly. The downside to the technology was it was heavy. Of course, Porsche substantially refined that over time with the all-wheel drive system on its 911s. So how does the GOAT drive today? Well, unbelievably, and again, this is just part of the sheer appeal and prowess of this car, it's so easy. It's so easy to drive, it's actually scary that a car with all this technology, that by comparison to today's cars really was in its infancy. I mean, it's so easy. A lovely natural balance to this car. The clutch has a beautiful weight to it, it's not too heavy at all. The gears are super easy to engage. It was 1,450 kilos, doesn't feel heavy at all. and so to its speed, and we've spoken about this quite a lot in the past. Twin turbocharged, but they work one after the other, not both in sync at the same time. First one comes in around 2,000 RPM, then again at around 4.5 grand, you get another almighty whack from behind from the bigger turbo. And you really feel that whole car just weight down at the back as the horizon comes towards you. It's still hilariously entertaining, even 35 years on. That pace wonderfully linear as well. I have to say though, yes, it does feel a fast car, moderately fast by today's standards, but it's just the grip and the traction on it is just absolutely insane. The 959 always feels like it has plenty of grip, and again, it just makes it a really nice car to drive and actually quite confidence inspiring. It's not a car that jumping into you feel scared to drive or scared to push. If anything, it does the opposite. It gives you the confidence to really push this. Again, we talk about confidence. The brakes on the 959 are superb. They really do stop this 959 dead in its tracks, which is a good thing, I'd say. It's best part of £1 million they're responsible for stopping. And considering this tech is the best part of 35 years old, it doesn't feel kind of redundant or superfluous or antiquated. Well then, here we are, the 992 interior. Let's be honest, there's not a stitch in here that reminds me of the 959. It's completely different. Even the driving position is different. There's now much more movement and rake on the steering wheel itself. The seat is on the floor. The 991 and the 992, to be fair, have absolutely nailed the seating position on the 911. The 959, by contrast, feels like you're sitting a lot more on top of the steering wheel and on top of that dashboard. Here, it's a much deeper dashboard. I'm much further away from the windscreen. Then we've got that digitisation, as I said, via the 10.9-inch PCM screen, the digital dials that, much to the chagrin of myself and other Porsche enthusiasts, has replaced the analogue dials that sat there before it. It's now digital screens. It's a modern interpretation, isn't it, of what is that original technology first debuted on the 959. Despite the fact that the layout and the materials and the haptics of the 992 are completely different from the 959, obviously there's 35 years between the two, from behind the wheel, reassuringly, there is definitely a connection between the two in terms of their DNA, their lineage. They both feel like proper Porsches to drive. That should absolutely be the case, of course. They're both still rear-engined, and despite the fact that the 992, obviously the wheelbase has grown and the engine has crept forward, as I say, it does still feel like a Porsche. You do still have to approach the drive in exactly the same way. Weighting the car up on corner entry is particularly important still, and both cars still enjoy handsome traction on corner exit as well. So as I say, there's a real connect between the two cars there. The other thing, and I mean, we talk about the 959 and having that 911-esque nose bob, it's been a trait of the 911 in terms of its driving setup for years. It is still there on the 992, not as much, has to be said, and of course the 992 is a lot stiffer than the 959. But you can still feel it, that nose bob is still there. So as I say, there are many characteristics dynamically between the 992 and that 959 from 35 years earlier. That duality and dexterity of the 959 has, in my opinion, never been as successfully carried over into a 911 generation as much as this, the 992. Lovely. Just want to go back to the start of the 992 generation, and many observers noted, myself included, to be totally honest, that the 992 was perhaps erring a little bit too much on the side of Grand Tourer rather than sports car, which the 911's always been known for. Now, as I've begun to spend more and more time with the 992 generation, I've kind of begun to realise that, well, that's a little bit of an unfair accusation. This is where the 992 is just really kind of excels itself as an engineering marvel. I really do think this is an astounding all-rounder. Consider this, super comfortable drive, particularly on UK roads, which are terrible, aren't they? Turn the sports exhaust off, it's quiet, relatively little tyre noise. If you're bombing through Europe, spending a long hard day at the wheel, it's a nice environment to be in. Turn it up, sport mode, manual mode if you like. When you push on, it still delivers that quintessential 911 performance that we have all come to know and love for what is approaching 60 years now. I really do think that is damned incredible. And bringing it back to the point, I would also say the only other car to get near this in terms of, as I say, that dexterity and all-round duality, it's that car in front. It's the 959. We need to talk about the tech. I think it's really important to start off by saying, although there's a lot of commonality between the two, that is in concept only. For example, the four-wheel drive system. Ostensibly, at its heart, the technology is very similar. Both are multi-plate clutches. That's how the four-wheel drive system works, and the variable four-wheel drive system, as I say, conceptually very, very similar. The reality, though, is in 35 years since, and Porsche being that superlative engineering company that it is, things will be changed and improved. On the 992, the outcome is that the multi-plate clutch system, as well as the front diff, incidentally, is water-cooled. It's also reinforced as well, and again, that is just to deal with the increased loads that are going to be on this four-wheel drive system. Power is a good place to go next. Again, on paper, both near enough 3 litres, the 959's 2.85 litres. This is bang on the nose 3 litres. Twin turbocharged 450 horsepower, but particularly we'll focus on the turbocharging element there. Both systems seek to minimise turbo lag. 959's approach is to have a small and a large turbocharger. The small turbocharger helping with that low end thrust, minimising the turbo lag, and then obviously the big snail is for the big wallop. The big wallop, as I say, comes in just after 4.5 grand. Again, things evolve at Porsche, and whilst this is twin turbocharged, they aren't sequential. The reality is they never have been on the 911 of any generation and any denomination, whether the turbo itself or latterly the turbocharged Carreras. The reality, or outcome is the word I'm using a lot for this video, is that the way the two cars drive, i.e. 959 and 992, and the way they deliver their power is very different. As I say, with the 959, there's almost a 2-stage approach to that deliverance of power. Really kicks on in the second half of the tacho. But that doesn't mean that the 992 generation isn't fun. You have pretty instant access to what amounts to maximum torque, fairly low down in the rev range, just after 2,000 RPM, and that kind of kicks you right the way round. It does mean, in my humble opinion, that the 959 has a little bit more character to the way that power is delivered. A technological tour de force, the 959 project took Porsche to the brink, but has arguably defined the company's ethos ever since. And that's why, more than 35 years on, the 959 has served as the blueprint for Porsche engineering excellence, evident in much of the technology still present, in concept at least, in our modern day 911s. And that's why, for many, the 959 always has and always will be the king of the road and simply the greatest of all time.